Okay, well, welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you for attending the VCE Loudoun's online learning classroom series for the spring with our Loudoun Master Gardeners. My name is Barbara Bailey. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator in charge of the Master Gardeners. Today we have Connie Moore, who is a Master Gardener since 2014. She's going to be presenting basic landscape design principles. So I'll turn it over to Connie, and I think you're in for a real treat. Connie, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Barbara. And I thank everyone for joining today. I have to say that I'm a Loudoun County Master Gardener, but I'm not a landscape architect. So I can't take you into the advanced content, but we do get training on landscape design in our program. And I've done a lot of landscaping with landscape architects over the course of my life. So I'll be sharing some of those ideas, principles, and lessons learned. So landscaping is not a particularly easy subject. There are many challenges. Barb, my slides aren't there. There are many challenges that landscapers face. In particular, if you're buying a new piece of, if you're buying a new house and it's on a property that was never developed, it's brand new, often you'll find that the soil is depleted, that maybe the builder has overplanted in order to have curb appeal, but the plants will never stand the test of time. And often you have to do a lot to build up the soil, and in some cases get rid of construction debris. On the other end of the scale, if you're buying a home that is an older home, you may have very mature gardens that need a refresh. They need updating. Maybe the trees are overgrown. Maybe the landscaping that was put in has deteriorated over time. So you have to bring it back up to your standard. Sometimes people come to us with problems of things aren't flowering or things aren't bearing fruit. And it's because over time, their landscape has gone from shady to sunny or sunny to shady, because maybe a tree is removed or a tree grows up or something else happens. And so the plants that were in place and thrived at one point in time start dying or not looking very good. A common problem in Loudoun County is wildlife. Either you want to attract wildlife, you want bluebirds, you want butterflies, or you want to stop wildlife because, you know, the deer are overrunning your garden. So that's a factor in landscaping as well. We also talk a lot with people in Loudoun County who have some pretty strict HOA restrictions, and it limits what they can do in terms of landscaping, maybe certain features they want to have, and it's not allowed in their community. Water is also a big issue, and sometimes people don't think about the water implications when they plant their gardens. And then they realize belatedly, either it's very labor intensive to keep watering, or maybe they have to construct more watering system to be able to sustain the water requirements in the summer. And then finally, budget and labor constraints. My husband and I have a running joke about my eye is bigger than our budget. And that includes putting in gardens that look fantastic and you can afford the plants and all the building up of the soil that you need to do. But then there's the maintenance, there's the weeding, there's the mulching. And if you have an appetite like mine, which is gardens everywhere, the actual labor fees of the people who help us maintain our garden can get out of control. So there are many more challenges, but in the end, the reward is well worth it, because there's not many things in life more satisfying than sitting in a beautifully designed garden and enjoying it at the end of day or maybe early in the morning with some coffee. So all of this work is well worth the effort and time and investment. Let's see. So the agenda that we have today, Barb, I think it's going to be better if you advance my slides. So,
all right.
The agenda that we have today is there are 7 principles of design when you're creating your landscape plan. We're going to step through those and see how to apply them. And then we're going to look at 6 key steps in the design process. And then I'm going to end with a real world example of landscaping a small space, a townhouse garden, and then landscaping a big space of 3 to 4 acres. Both of those will have been my projects, my properties, and so I'll share those experiences with you. Next slide. One of the first principles is, in design principles, is to know the form that you're shooting for. So you can see houses that are asymmetrical, and that calls for an asymmetrical landscape design, or you can have symmetrical houses. The one in the upper right-hand corner is my house, and it's the wings of the house are hidden by the tulip magnolias, but it's very Georgian. It's actually a copy or adaptation of the Wythe House in Williamsburg. And so if you have a house like that, it pretty much dictates the kind of garden you're going to have. And whatever we do on the left, we need to do on the right. Otherwise, our house starts looking out of balance. Whereas the one beside it, that's asymmetrical, the wing is on one side, the driveway is asymmetrical. You can see they have a tree on one side that's offset by a smaller tree on the other side. And the bushes in the front, while they complement the porch, are not the same. So that's the first design principle. The next design principle is to focus on the form and the line. And that is, next slide, that is extremely important because you have a different look with different plants in terms of the profile that they create. So you have a weeping tree as an example of a very curved, natural, gentle profile, which creates a form and a line. And then you have this very stark contrast of a conical plant that has a certain look. And generally speaking, the curved, natural, gentle lines are more relaxing. The straight lines or rigid lines have a more action. They call you to action. They call you to attention. And so unwittingly, you may be putting in plants that create a certain emotion. And once you're aware of this, you can do this intentionally to have a relaxing setting with curved lines, or an attention-oriented, designed, call the person to feel the activity in putting in this well articulated look. So that's very important to keep in mind, because as you start mixing plants, you have to be very careful to mix them correctly. Otherwise, they will begin to fight with one another. I have an example of a linear design in the next slide. And this is where the gardening, in this case, was tiered and sectioned off by straight lines. So they don't combine curved with the straight. And that is one of the principles, is if you're going to go with a curved approach, you want to put that throughout your garden. if you go with a straight approach, a linear approach, then you want to be consistent and have that throughout your garden. Now, you can move spaces. So a garden on one side of the house might be quite different from a garden on the other side of the house, but you don't want to have a jumble of curvilinear and linear together. And this is a beautifully done garden where the tiers start on the left and cascade down to what feels like a room on the right with the gravel and the sunken layer. And that's one of the things that I try and shoot for in landscaping, is to create rooms, outdoor rooms, so to speak, that give a certain feeling and provide an extension of your interior home to your exterior home. And you can have meditative rooms, you can have carefully pruned and well clipped boxwoods that give you that call to action. So there are many different emotions you can bring into a garden. Now, if you look at the next slide, there's an example of the two different styles going on, of a curved style and a straight style. Both of these are beautiful. One of the principles is to avoid mixing styles, because then you start creating a jumbled effect, or an effect that it fights, one style fights with the other style. Now, it is possible to do these two ideas together, but you have to be very careful, and you have to more or less carve off a section that's linear and another section that's curved, and find a way to transition between the two. The next slide shows a gorgeous example of a garden where they've taken into account the principles that I've mentioned, the form, the line, the balance and equilibrium, and taking in curved and the trees that are both more curved and the evergreen that's conical. They've done an outstanding job of combining all the different looks. This is also a slide to talk about that when you are landscaping, you're not just landscaping close to the ground, or knee height, or waist height. You're landscaping up into the sky. And so you can see here that if you're walking down this path and you're looking at all these gorgeous plants that are close to the ground, it's complemented by tiers or layers of plants that are higher and higher. When I worked with an interior designer doing some of the home rooms in my home, one of the lessons that I learned is that interior designers think in terms of 4 layers, 4 levels. So there's the floor level where you would put a carpet or rug or hardwood floors. There's the sitting level where you would pay attention to the chairs and sofas and things like that. There's the standing level where you would look at paintings and things that are hanging on the wall. And then there's the ceiling level where you look at not only the drapes, but maybe the ceiling has some sort of design on top of it, or some sort of embellishment around the light fixtures and so forth. So if you take that concept of how you would design for the inside of a house, you can bring it into your landscaping ideas. And this slide is a very good example of how someone did that. This is a garden in France, and it is truly beautiful. The next slide shows another design principle, which is proportion. And this happens lots of times when builders get plant trees that get very, very mature and very large, and it completely overtakes the building. So here you have a one-story building, and the tree beside it is so tall, it actually diminishes the building. And so you want to think about, and this gets tricky, you want to think about how high your bushes will become, how high your trees will become, how wide the spread is, because you can plant some trees that seem fairly narrow in the beginning of life, and then they become broader and broader and broader. And you know, sometimes you see trees that are broader than the structure. So the proportion and scale need to complement each other over time. And that's a really important lesson to learn. That often is blown off when you have builders who plant trees to make the house sell, and that it doesn't work over time. The fourth design principle is a style. You want to pick a style, and you can be as original and creative as you want to be. That's one reason landscaping is so much fun and so rewarding, is you can put yourself into it. It can reflect who you are. So the upper left is just a small garden I have on the side of my property, and it's easy to maintain. It's got hydrangeas, it's got dogwoods, and I always plant impatiens because of this shade. And tucked away is a fox. And the fox is so realistic, people usually think that there's a real fox in my house and come to my house and say, did you know there's a fox outside? And I'll say, yeah, I do. And the birdhouses on the right, that is from a telephone pole in Waterford. There's very little space for gardening in Waterford because the structures are so close to the street. And so some creative person decided to go up in their design and just have an array of birdhouses. So really the sky is the limit in expressing your own style, but you want to be consistent. So one of the things, there are three ways I think of landscaping, and I've already mentioned the idea of interior design concepts and applying that to outdoors. Another way to think of landscaping is your attire. So when you get dressed in the morning and you put on like your basic outfit, so maybe it's a top, maybe it's a dress, and you know, it can be different things, but it's your basic outfit. And then you start adorning it. And maybe you put earrings on, or a necklace, or a bracelet, or a scarf, or maybe you put a pin to hold the scarf in place. And then you decide what kind of shoes you're going to have. So you want to, when you're getting dressed, you want everything to flow and everything to be complementary. So you want the style of shoes you've got, maybe if they're formal, they don't match your casual outfit, or vice versa. And so the style you bring to your gardens, you want to have some consistency in it. Otherwise, it becomes jarring to walk through the garden or walk through the space. But if you can be consistent in your style and apply it throughout your property, that creates a thing of beauty. The other thing is, if you do anything in the visual arts, like painting, pastels, oils, acrylics, and things like that, you know that one of the things that makes for great art is that it flows. So if you use red in the corner, you want to put some dots or elements of red throughout the painting in order to give it harmony. And I think gardens are the same way. Landscaping is the same way. So the person who has the chair here with the plant in it, it's a very informal look. You would extend that informal look throughout that particular space. You might have a more formal look in another space, but they wouldn't be clashing with one another. They would be complementing each other. Okay, in our next slide, we have the principle of texture. And texture is actually can be really, really fun to work with. And so here you see exfoliating bark. And so I have crepe myrtles that exfoliate all through the winter, and they're close to my entrance. And it creates a sense of gardening in the wintertime because of the way the bark is, or birches or other exfoliating trees can be a thing of beauty. It doesn't have to be a leaf or a flower. You can have soft touching leaves that almost call you to feel of them, and are soothing to look at and create a sense of meditation. I use a lot of lamb's ear because I like texture. You can have spiky flowers that the blooms are actually spiky rather than smooth. All of those things that you mix together of contrasting textures can be as interesting as colors that you mix together. So texture is something that I think people often overlook, but it's another element to bring to your look in your landscape. The next principle is rhythm and unity. And I've been talking about that throughout. It's very important to have this harmonious feeling. And you get it by having repetition. And so on the one on the right, you see that there is this burnt orange rust color that's replicated in various other shades throughout this space. And they've taken the spikiness of the grass that's in the near to the viewer, and you see further more grasses that are spiky. And then at the far end, you see even where the trees have a spiky feel. And that provides this unity through repetition. But it isn't just completely boring repetition, it's alternating look. So that invites you to look more closely at the space. And on the left, they've used the border of, it looks like rocks to me, and they've used the repetition of the orange flowers and yellow flowers to create that harmonious feeling. It also gives you a sense of movement so that it draws you to walk through the garden to see what else is around the corner. So one of the rules of thumb is on our next slide, and it has to do with how unified you make the area look versus how much you provide contrast. And the rule of thumb is based on how heavily traveled the space is. So in public spaces, and we have them in Leesburg by, say, the parking lot, the multi-tiered parking lot. There's some really interesting landscaping along the side of that, and it's a heavily traveled area. So it's not too contrasting. It's very unified with the brick sidewalks, with spaces to sit that have the same kind of metal furniture you sit on, and the trees are repetitive. So what you would have is 90% unity, 10% contrast. If you go to a private garden, you want more contrast, and that's where the style comes in, where you show your flair and the things you like, but you don't want too much contrast. So the principle is 70% unity and 30% contrast to keep it interesting. Anything that goes beyond 45% contrast is cluttered, chaotic, and is not pleasing to the person walking through the garden. So that unity, repetition, alternating, sequencing concept, having lines and forms that are complementary, that's all part of having a harmonious design versus a cluttered, chaotic design. Okay, and our next principle is transition. I've mentioned how you can transition from one style to another. It's compartmentalizing your spaces. And here are two examples of how you build the transition to get from one space to another. So the photo on the right is a very interesting use of non-life materials, of pavers and stones and rocks. And the colors give you that sense of transition. The squares give you a sense of that transition. So you may have been coming from a very different looking garden to get to where the chairs and table are. And the walkway is providing that harmonious look. Or the one on the left I really like because you don't know what's around the corner. But this would be a very good way to transition from one type of garden to another. And it gives the person walking through the garden a sense of excitement, turning the corner. And you can do this by doing ascending or descending heights. You can do gradual shifts in color. You can do all of the things that plants offer you in terms of their color, texture, foliage shape, and shade versus sun. And all of those things can help you give those transitions that make it a delight to stroll through the gardens. And then our next principle is color. I think a lot of people think of color first because that's, you know, with the vividness of plants and everything, it's kind of where you tend to start when you're looking at landscaping a space. But it's important to think about color year-round and not just in spring and summer. Fall has interesting colors. There are plants that come up in the fall that are very different but very vibrant. And then winter is important. You might want to have ground covers that stay green during the winter. Here you have bark that's very vivid red, and that is a beautiful contrast against the snow, or it would be a beautiful contrast against just a bare piece of land in the middle of December or January. So colors are very important. Okay, our next slide we're shifting gears. We've gone through the principles to think about when you're landscaping, and now we're going to shift to the actual process. What steps do you go through to create your landscape design? So the first thing you have to do is look at your site. And you want to look at the neighbors and see what their homes look like. You want to look at what's shady, what's sunny. You want to just do an analysis of your site. And you want to think about what your family needs and wants out of a garden. Maybe you need a swimming pool, maybe you need a gardening shed. And you develop a plot plan. So on the right, you have a plot plan, and you can see the house, you can see the driveway, and you can see the gardens that they're going to create. And you want to work toward that. It helps if you have an active family to create areas that you're going to dedicate to certain purposes. My husband has his whole vegetable area. I don't do anything with it. It's his area. The same thing with the fruit trees. And I take care of the rest of the planning for gardening, other things. And at the end, you get to your plant selection and placement. And I think sometimes people, when they don't know about landscaping, start with the plants, and that can lead to just really no landscape at all. It's just a bunch of plants without any idea of what you're trying to do with this space and how with the feeling you want to create. So let's look at these steps in the design phase. So the first thing you want to do is take a look and see what you're working with. One of the things we talk about all the time in Master Gardening is get a soil test. This is a very easy thing to do. You take samples of soil throughout the place where you're planning to garden, and you send this off to Virginia Tech, and they will send back a report saying how acidic is your soil, what do you need to do to support your plans. Is your soil well suited for vegetable gardening, or is there something that you need to take into consideration before you go there? So understanding what soil you have is very important. You also want to look at the exposure, not just the sun, but also the wind. And I have a very windy property, and so certain plants that I planted and the soil was fine and the sun was fine did not thrive because that particular area was so cold in the wintertime from the wind. It would kill the plants, kill the trees. And so you need to take into account all the elements of this. The other thing I had to learn the hard way is that I would plant plants where they would get too much sun because I would see that the plant needed full sun. Well, full sun is 6 hours a day. And I was planting plants in full sun where there was never shade and they were burning up. So this can save you a lot of money thinking about the exposure and the implications. And you can even have microclimates. Where I live has a microclimate, partly because of the wind. You may need to screen some views that you don't like, or you may be unable to screen some views if you've got an HOA restriction. So the whole idea of whether or not you're going to try and attempt screening with plants is something to think about. You also have literal boundaries of what you can and can't do, like a creek that runs through multiple plots of land, not just your own. You have things you can't do anything about, like utility boxes and lines. When I moved into my house, we have a utility box. It's not just for our house, but for our neighbors. And it was hidden by a giant rhododendron. And you can't even see it. It's deep in the middle of the plant. So that's a factor to think about, as well as what existing trees are there that you want to work around, and what existing hardscaping. Hardscaping are driveways, sidewalks, things like that. Okay, next slide is, what do you want? Really, it's like I said, it's like art. It's like painting, and you have a blank canvas to start with. If you have a new house and nothing's been planted, or in my case, I have a house that I bought that was 20 years old and no one had ever planted anything. So it was, once again, what did I want, and what do I like? But you also have to take into account the style of your property, the style of your neighbors. You might want to try and have a harmonious look in your neighborhood. So what already exists? How much time do you have to devote to taking care of gardens? Because I'm telling you, that's one of my biggest problems, is putting in way too much garden for me to handle, and then I have to get people to help me. How much budget do you have? Not only for the plants when you put in, but maybe it's pruning, fruit trees, maybe it's a lot of pruning. How much can you support, and what do you have to work around? Then the next thing you need to do when designing your plan is to create that plot. And if you're like my husband, who's an engineer, it's all to scale and it's done very accurately, and it represents what you're going to do. If you're like me, it's not to scale, but it's a good concept. I'm very creative. It doesn't matter. The whole purpose of the plot plan is for it to be your guidelines for how you're going to go about doing this. And it's very helpful to have a plan that's the big picture. And then you can pick off sections that you want to work on. And that keeps you from being overwhelmed. It keeps you from being exhausted. And it keeps you from blowing your budget. But the big picture plot plan is extremely helpful. The next slide shows the idea of finding the locations for what it is you want to put in gardening wise, and then how you're going to design this around your family. So in this instance, there's a public area of which is the entrance. And remember I said you want more unity in your entrance than randomness. And so you would, in this public area, shoot for some repetitiveness, maybe a hedge, maybe alternating plants, something that gives it a sense of repetition and not chaos. Then in the back, by the back exit to the property, they have their living space. So maybe this is where they grill things, maybe where they want a patio, where they want to have the idea of the extended room. Then you see in the right-hand corner, quiet zone. That to me would mean you want a meditative space where you can go and relax and get recharged and rejuvenated. This family looks like they have children, they have a play area designated, maybe there's playground material. And then they've got obviously someone who wants to do flower gardening and someone who wants to do vegetable gardening. And so all those other factors of what kind of soil do you have, what kind of sun, other elements, what kind of things do you already have in place, what kind of HOA restrictions do you have, all of that is a factor in doing this, designing your activities. But you want to put this idea into your landscape plan, your landscape plot. Okay, and then on the next slide is where it gets really, it's up to you. It's up to your preferences and your style and what you like. The only thing, we have an adage in Master Gardening saying, get the right plant for the right place. And every gardener I know has thrown away a lot of money getting the wrong plant for a place, or getting a plant that's perfect, but they put it in the wrong place. And so you want to get both of these right. You want a plant that's right for your soil, and you want to put it in the place where it needs shade. Or if it's a plant that's the right soil, you need to make sure it's in the sun. And if you fight against that, it's not going to work out. I'll tell you what I did. This is one of my biggest mistakes. Fortunately, it's not irreparable. It doesn't hurt anything. It's just what I tried to do was completely idiotic. There was a property behind my house, maybe, I don't know, 6 acres away from my house. But nonetheless, it was a big property and I wanted to screen it. And so I thought, I really like willow trees. So I had this vision of willow trees going up high, covering the view that I wanted to block out, and having drooping leaves and branches down to the ground and just blocking it out. Well, what I did is I put a willow tree, which almost demands water. You could have them stand in water. They love water so much. And I put it in what would be a horse field. And so this willow tree has barely grown. It's been there 10 years. It doesn't screen anything. The leaves and branches don't go down to the ground because I got a cultivar that doesn't do all the drooping. And I look at that plant all the time. It's probably 1.5 stories tall now. And I just think, oh, wrong plant, wrong place, bad idea. Fortunately, it doesn't hurt anything. And now what I've done is I've taken pity on that poor willow and I water it during the summer because it has no water source. So there's my true confession. So things you want to think about is, where do you want your beds? Where do you want your foot traffic to go? And what do you want your foot traffic to be looking at? Like maybe it's your foot traffic from point A to point A in your garden where you go all the time, and what you go through doesn't really matter. It's more utilitarian. Whereas you have other sections of your garden that are meant to be enjoyed and serene, and you give it a lot of thought what the passageway is going to look like. Look at slope, drainage, all of that. And then on the right-hand side, you have here the different plant factors that we've gone through: color, texture, fragrance. I pay a lot of attention to fragrance, and I group plants so that I have a fragrant space. And so there are many different ways to think about the combinations, and these are some of the factors. Okay, on our next slide, we're going to take a look at what I did in a small space and in a large space. So back when, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was first getting set up in life, I had a townhouse. And this townhouse had been around for a while, but no one had done anything with it. So if you imagine you're standing at the bottom of this drawing, and this is one of my drawings, so it's not to scale, and you're standing on a concrete patio that has nothing that adorns it, zero, just a post holding the balcony up. And the only live thing in this garden besides grass is a rose bush that doesn't really flower. And so that was my before. And I decided I want a garden beautiful. And so I set about doing that. And the next slide is my hand-drawn graphic of what I did. So, and this was really pretty lucky because I didn't know what I was doing, to be honest. But the first thing I decided is that I needed to put in some walkways. And these were not walkways to anywhere important. They were just walkways to take you through the garden. So I took some crushed rocks that are actually my favorite landscaping rock. They're called Tipple Red, and they have a deep burgundy reddish color. And I really like it better than pea gravel, although pea gravel is the traditional type of rock. And I put in this walkway, and I actually went from the patio, and I put in a new deck. And so there's a stairway down, and that got you to the crushed rock pathway. And this meandering curvilinear approach went out to the gate that left the property and frankly went down a berm, and you would never go there because there's nothing to go there for. And this little pathway that goes to the right was simply to have a seating area. So it hit a fence, is what it hit. Then I decided to put in my bushes and trees. So on the right-hand bottom side, I put in a weeping birch that would go up to be 2 or 3 stories tall, but it was not a big spread, and the weeping was gorgeous. And so I put that in. I also put in Japanese maple, which is one of my favorite things to design with. I put in a Harry Lauder's walking stick because I do like very curved plants and intriguing plants. And then I put in a weeping juniper. The cornerstone of the garden was a fish pond. And so this fish pond was maybe 4 feet by 8 feet, something like that. And it was gorgeous. There was a waterfall. I had water lilies. I had lotuses. And I put in grasses and rocks, larger size rocks, as the border for the curved lily pond. and put in rocks stacked up against the fence and put grasses in to make it look like a natural landscape. And then I used mulch and perennial bulbs and grasses to pull this all together. And I had places really to sit and meditate. So soon after this, I met my husband and we got married, and we would spend every morning on the weekends with our coffee out by the lily pond, watching the waterfall and enjoying the flowers and just taking the scene in. It's a totally transformed landscape. I did all the work, I did all the planning, and it was a big plus when we sold the house. The people really liked the landscaping. So that's an example of a small space you can do a lot of things with. And I think that it was good in that I kept a curved design. I kept a concept of weeping plants, and I had the rock combination of small rock and larger rock and bigger rocks for the waterfall. So that provided some unity as well. Now we're going to look at landscaping in a big space. And this landscaping is still in process, and it's been several years that we've been working on it. So I had to take the cue from my house. My house is Georgian, and so everything in the garden needs to tie into the house. When we bought this house, as I said, it was 20 years old, but no one had done anything with it. And so I was just saying, I have got to get mature trees right now. I could hardly tolerate the idea of being a house in the middle of a horse field and nothing around it. I also had moved from a home that had a large fish pond and had a screen porch, and I could hardly bear living there without a fish pond and a screen porch. So as you can tell, my husband felt a lot of pressure from me to do things. So we wanted to do the landscaping quickly, so we had some quick results, but we knew we couldn't do it all at once. So we decided to tackle it in phases. There are anywhere between 20 and 30 deer that come through our property every day. They go through it one way and then in the evening and through it another way in the morning. And so we wanted to avoid plants that attract deer. No plant is fail-safe from deer. They're going to eat whatever they want to eat if they're really hungry. But there are plants that they just love, and there are plants that they don't like. And so we have specialized in plants that deer don't like. Okay, next slide. Let me see if I can orient us. So if we're standing at the bottom of this page where it says there's a boxwood on the left and there's a boxwood on the right, that was the extent of landscaping my house had, is 2 boxwoods. And then on both sides of the boxwood further out were 2 spruce trees that were 2 stories tall, but they were girdled. They were severely girdled, and they were going to die. But before we could get them taken out, a big windstorm came through and snapped one of the trees. So they were not salvageable, and not really even, they didn't look very good. So we moved the boxwoods to the front entrance of the driveway near the fences. And we took the girdled spruces out. And so that meant the front of our very large exterior had no plants. And then we had wings with the garages, and in the behind, there was just grass. The grass and grass and grass, as far as you could see, no gardens, no anything. So the next slide shows how we started tackling it. Now this orientation is reversed from the previous slide. So at the top of this diagram is the house. And if you were standing looking toward the bottom of this slide, that would be looking out the front area of the house. And so we put in we paved the drive. We call this stage 1. We paved the drive, and then we put in 2 of those exfoliating crepe myrtles, which are 2 stories tall now, and we want them to be 2 stories tall. On the main part of the house and the garage wings, we put in laurels, which are beautiful. They're about to pop right now. They're beautiful white flowering laurels. And then we put at the edges of both wings magnolia trees. And so with this, and further out toward the fences, we put in dogwoods, and then we use perennials and annuals to provide colors. The ground cover, we've got a mixture of different ground covers, and we have Siberian irises that are in the beds as well. We also put in 2 sweet gum trees, and we put in a cultivar that only has 20% of the normal amount of the balls that fall, the spiky balls. So we don't have as much litter on the ground. But the reason we chose sweet gum is they have really beautiful foliage in the fall, and because they grow very, very quickly, and they also don't have a big spread, so they go up and not out, and we didn't want to block the house. And then we finish it with containers. So right now I have pansies that are going in all the urns and containers, and I have those going in the urns near the front entrance of the house as well. So it has this unity. Then once we get further into the spring, we'll plant them with plants all that like sun, because it's a very sunny place. And then continue into the winter with kale and cabbages and so forth. So that was stage 1. Then the next slide shows stage 2 and 3. So first I want to get you reoriented. At the bottom of the slide is the den. So if you walk up in this instance, you would go onto a very large screen porch, which I use very much as a room. And then we've divided the gardens into what we call the koi garden, and on the right we call it the pagoda garden. So we did the koi garden first, and the very first thing we did is put in a pond, and the pond is the opposite of any other fish pond I've ever built. Is very linear, so it's rectangular and it's quite large, but it picks up on the house, the themes of the house, and it mirrors the screen porch. And then we put pavers around the pond to provide an outdoor room. So we have a lot of seating area, and we have table and chairs for eating outside. Irises pair well with ponds because irises like to grow around ponds. And so we have a backdrop of irises, and we have rhododendrons on the side because it's shady part of the gardens. And then where there's more sun, we have herbs, and then we have a shady corner which has a hydrangea. I didn't draw the whole thing, but we have a dry stack of wall that really pulls this into feeling like a room. Then on the right side, stage 3, we could only do stage 2 in phases. So that was probably 2 or 3 years to get the pond, the pavers, the dry stack wall, and the gardens in place. Then we started looking at stage 3, the other side, and it was just grass. We put in a pagoda tree, a Japanese pagoda tree, and it has provided the perfect combination of sun and shade in this area. So we have a lot of opportunity to do shade garden and sun garden. So we, not too long ago, maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, really tackled this. So we put in pavers for part of this space, but then we put that crushed rock that I like, tipple red, in the other part of this space. In the shady area, we did hydrangeas, ferns, helleborus, columbine, and some other things. And it would go under the pagoda tree, and where there's a bench and a bird bath and a very meditative area. And we married, I mean, we took the design from the dry stack on the koi pond side, and we put columns of stone and then interlaced it with boxwood. So it has columns of stone, boxwood plantings in a row, and then more columns, and it unified the space, but it wasn't a direct copy of the other garden. And then in the sunny area, we have roses, and then in the corner, tucked away where there's very little wind, really no wind, and it's a perfect combination of shady and sunny, we put a fig tree that is very, very abundant fruit. And I use containers to really extend the plantings in this area, because I put containers on the pavers to create more garden than just the stuff in the ground. Then the very last thing we did is we put a pergola in straight behind the screen porch. So if you can imagine the very top of this slide, if you keep going, there's a pergola. There are tables and chairs to sit out there. It has wisteria and jasmine growing on it, and it's beautiful. It's a floral delight in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall. And then I did use a curved design to tie the two gardens together, and I used that tipple red crushed rock, so there's consistency in color and texture, and then bordered it with liriope. And what I forgot to draw on this diagram is along that rock, walkway at the top is bordered by fairly large mature boxwoods. A friend of mine gave them to me when she was selling her property, and so it was a wonderful gift to receive. So let's take a look at the end result, and this is the koi garden, and this is when it was first put in. So it's quite a large fish pond, probably 15 feet long, maybe probably 18 feet long, something like that. And you can see where at the time it was all sunny, and I lost some plants because it was too sunny. I didn't understand what full sun really meant. It doesn't mean burn your plants up. And so you can see that we put the wall in, and now stuff is up much higher, and it's more mature looking, and it's loaded with lots of containers. So this is maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And then the next slide shows the other side, the pagoda tree garden. And this is when we first started. So here you have a sense of how much grass there is. And the patio hadn't been put in, the planting hadn't been put in. We were getting the bones in, the columns and the boxwoods in to define this space. We had this pergola out there, was kind of floating. It wasn't connected to the house or the gardens. And we had these two little river birch trees on either side, and they've like tripled in size now. And then if we look at the next slide, you'll see a hint of what I'm talking about with the shade garden and sun garden in the pagoda side. So the pagoda tree is the tree that you see on the left, and it's shady enough. There are lots and lots of hydrangeas, and coleus thrive, and cleome is doing well here as well. So this is just a slice of what the garden looks like. But that was really a change almost overnight. So a year, when you choose the right plants, it can really make a difference. You can mature your gardens very quickly. Here's another shot of the walkway that I described that has the triple red rock that is curved and goes out to the pergola. In this, I couldn't possibly get the whole length of this garden, but this garden has a repetition of purple and yellows and orange. And it's all sun. This is a very sunny spot right here. So there's an example of how to landscape in a large space, and containers do help. I have a lot of exits that we don't use. We have so many exits because it's a Georgian design. They're exits you don't need. And so I just fill them up with plants. And here's an example of the plants here. In the left, you see the fig tree is coming up in a protected space. So those are a few snapshots of what you can do landscaping in a big place. So what did I learn? In both instances, with the townhouse garden and with Grassley Hall, we chose fast growth trees because I wanted immediate gratification, and I'm really glad we did. I've already said we derived the style from the house. Hardscaping was critical. If we just had gardens out there, they would literally float in a sea of grass. And so connecting everything and providing a way for people to walk through the gardens was very, very important. I think it's important in any landscape, and the bigger the landscape gets, the more it's crucial. Think of the outdoor rooms, think of the layers, think of height, not just at your eye level. And think of all those things we mentioned: texture, color, contrast, and so forth. We use mulch and compost extensively to reduce the weeding. Weeding is an issue, and anything we can do to keep it under control, we do. We have a lot of gardens to keep clean. I've told you about my mistakes in sun and wind. It's very important to keep in mind. And know that if you embark on a big gardening landscape project, even if it's scaled to like your townhouse, that there's maintenance involved, and the maintenance, it needs to be part of your budget. I embrace wildlife, and so my deer on the property, they don't like irises, they don't like roses, they don't like a lot of our spiky plants. I plant lots of marigolds. I do everything I can to minimize wildlife inflicting damage, and we actually enjoy watching the wildlife, and it's a real treat when they come and hang out in our patios. We take pictures and enjoy it. So I think landscaping is it's very gratifying to do. It's fun to put plants in the ground and see what happens. I think it's also extremely gratifying to enjoy, to have guests over and sit in the garden or sit in whatever space you've created and just enjoy what you've done. And it has a monetary value too. Trees in particular can drive up the value of a property that may have started out with nothing. So that is my presentation. We have lots of resources on landscaping, and here are some of them. And we have a help desk. During the pandemic, things are different, but in normal times, we have a help desk that you can call and ask questions or send emails. And I'm happy to answer questions now if there are some.
Hey, just a little bit. You can send an email to our help desk at loudounmg@vt.edu. We are manning the help desk virtually, so that's a great way to ask a question. I don't see any questions in the chat box, Connie.
Well, that makes me feel good too. Maybe I covered the subject.
You did a fantastic job. Beautiful photos. We really appreciate it. If anybody has any questions, please call our help desk, and we can help you with hopefully with some landscaping ideas. But we're getting a thank you so much in the comments.
Well, thank you. Thank you for attending. Thank you for being interested in this topic, and we look forward to having a dialogue with you in the future.
Yes, so thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Take care and stay safe out there. Thank you, Connie.
You're welcome.